Good morning. Thanks for joining us. I can see people coming in, which is great. So we'll just give it a couple of minutes, and then we will get started with today's webinar. So thanks for taking the time out of your day. Really appreciate you coming in, and looking forward to the presentation and also answering any questions you might have as well through the course of the webinar. Cool. So I can see there's a few people still filing in, but we're keen to get things started. So we'll kick off with a bit of an introduction. So yeah, thank you for today. This is our Unlocking the Value in Energy Flexibility webinar. So we've been running a couple of webinars across the year. This is the third one in the Simply webinar series. So we started in the earlier with a webinar on the future of energy in New Zealand. We then ran a session around efficiency with Glenn Wellington from ECA, and this is our third one focused on flexibility. And we're fortunate enough today to be joined by John Campbell from Our Energy and James Tipping from Vector. And there's going to be two elements to the webinar today. So we've got a bit of an overview, and I'll kick things off and setting the scene and talking a bit around the value in energy flexibility. And then I'm going to pass over to James and John, who are going to talk through the FlexForum, which is an initiative that was launched earlier this year, really to bring together industry, a lot of members across industry to think about what the future of flexibility looks like in New Zealand, and ultimately set out a plan of how we can accelerate the provision and the development of flexibility and the value that it can offer to New Zealand. So I don't want to jump too much into their presentation, but it's very timely as well, because there's been a recent release of the FlexForum roadmap plan. So John and James are going to talk through a bit of that and give some information about what lies on the road ahead. We'll then have a bit of a break, an opportunity to answer some of your questions. So if you do have any questions throughout the webinar, please just put them into the Q&A. And then we'll pick up some of those questions in the middle of the webinar once we've given a bit of an overview of the FlexForum and the road ahead. And then I'm going to spend a bit of time talking through some practical examples of some projects and some initiatives that are currently happening across the industry in New Zealand, and talk a bit about our Demand Flex program and platform that we offer up at the moment within Simply. So hopefully that's a good start for introductions. So I'm going to kick things off and just talk a bit around, why there is an interest in flexibility and the importance of the initiatives that are currently happening in the industry, and equally why FlexForum are putting a lot of effort and time and focus into this space. So I'm sure we've got a lot of people from across the industry in this call, and are well aware of the changes that are happening at the moment. But really, we are seeing, quite a significant shift across the energy landscape in New Zealand due to three key things. So decentralized generation, so generation that sits away from main generation plants across the grid, electrification, and predominantly in the spaces of transport and process heat, is really pushing up demand, and will continue to push up demand as we work towards reducing emissions here through that method, and transferring from fossil fuel transport and certainly fossil fuel process heat. A lot of focus in this area at the moment. How do we support both residential fleets of vehicles, but also commercial fleets to transition across? And through the good work that ECA are currently doing with the Giddy Fund, there's a lot of focus in the process heat space. And there's a really interesting kind of merging of both the electrification and flexibility pieces, which I'll touch on a little bit later. And then finally, the clear growth in renewables as we work towards the aspirational target of 100% renewables by 2030. Obviously, that brings a reduction in emissions across the grid, but also proposes some interesting new challenges, because the predominant growth will be across solar and wind. So great resources, but obviously come with intermittency. And flexibility then is of course one area that we can support with firming and balancing out some of the intermittency that those forms of generation bring. So in terms of where flexibility can come from, this term distributed energy resources is used quite frequently, and is a pretty broad term for any asset. So small scale electricity supply or demand resources, so something like a generator, or an EV charger or battery that sits within an EV itself. right across to distributed generation assets, so solar panels on a roof, small scale wind, and an area that we're particularly interested in simply is around that flexible load piece. So existing plant, compressors, pumps, refrigeration within businesses that can be used to help support the grid. There was a fantastic report that came out from Transpower looking at the future of DER and the growth in this space. So their estimation was the value of DER across New Zealand will be circa 1 billion annually by 2050 as we work towards net zero. So a lot of focus in this space. It's a key component of supporting the transition to net zero, especially with intermittent renewables coming in. So I'm going to pass over to James now from Vector, James Tipping, and he's going to talk a bit more about the work that FlexForum have been doing. So James, over to you.
Thanks, James. Tēnā koutou katoa, ko James Tipping tōko ingoa. My day job is the GM of Market Strategy and Regulation at Vector, the Auckland-based energy portfolio company. At Vector, I lead the team that engages with all Vector's market-facing regulators. So that's the Electricity Authority, the gas industry company, and the Australian regulators, as we have a significant metering and data business over the other side of the ditch. Prior to joining Vector, I had a bit over 2 years with the Electricity Authority as a Chief Strategy Officer, and 10 years before that working with Trustpower in Tauranga in a range of different roles from generation investment to strategy development. So I think I've just clocked over 20 odd years now in the electricity sector, and flexibility is a topic that I know John and I have a lot of passion for, and really happy to be here. So thank you for the opportunity, James and co, for hosting us today. So I'll be kicking off today, then I'll hand over to John. I just want to go to the next slide, please, James. And in terms of what John and I are going to cover, we'll aim to talk to you for about 15 minutes or so before we have a bit of a break for some Q&A. Firstly, we want to make sure, just build on what James is just sharing on what we mean by flexibility and why it's important, some of that broader context. Then we'll talk about this group, the FlexForum, that we formed this year and has been running, its purpose, its objectives, and its members. Then I'll hand over to John. We'll talk about the Flex Plan 1.0, go through that in a little bit of detail, the next steps for the FlexForum, and then lastly, we'll wrap up with how you can get involved. So next slide, please, James. Thank you. So as James alluded to before, there's a pretty significant transition going on in New Zealand's electricity sector, but it's not just New Zealand, it's globally. So just about every electricity sector, at least in the developed world, is going through the same sort of transition. The way I like to describe it is that traditionally we had a reasonably inflexible demand side. So consumers like us, and certainly me, we don't pay too much attention to what happens in the power sector. We just do what we want to do. We use power when we want to use it, and we get a bill at the end of the month. You could almost set your watch by the 2 daily peaks in demand across New Zealand, the morning and evening peaks. And really all the flexibility in the system to meet that demand came from the supply side. So big hydro dams, coal and gas plant ramping up and down to meet those fluctuations in demand across the day, across the week, across the year. What's happening now, as James mentioned, is we're moving to a much greater proportion of what we call intermittent or variable or non-dispatchable renewable generation plant. So primarily wind and solar being built, not just in New Zealand, but around the world. And so you're getting an increasingly inflexible supply side, and those traditional roles that I talked about are really being flipped on their heads. So with much more wind and solar, you've got less flexibility on the supply side, and you're requiring more flexibility on the demand side to play that balancing role. So really the demand side become kind of the superstars of the sector coming in to save the day. So when we talk about flexibility, we say it's got multiple uses. It's valuable to households, communities and businesses, absolutely, but also really significant benefits to the power system and to market operation. And when we talk about flex, we're saying that's things like modifying generation or consumption patterns in response to a signal to achieve a desired outcome. And there are benefits, as I say, right across the supply chain. So more flexibility means we can reduce energy-related capital costs. We won't need as many power stations to be built. We won't need as many poles and wires on both the transmission and the distribution network. We can reduce operational costs from electricity. So particularly thinking about we can burn less coal and gas if our flexibility can come from different sources. We can improve reliability and resilience. So we're less reliant on a small number of big power stations to keep the lights on. We can actually use a much less concentrated, more diverse base of resources. And we can get great outcomes in terms of reducing emissions and supplying services right across the grid. So James introduced that concept of distributed resources, which they definitely can be flexible. And these are resources that can either consume or store or generate, and they're dotted around the distribution network rather than being these really big chunky assets that are connected into the transmission network. And there, thinking about a number of examples, James touched on some before. There's some great case studies on the Simply Energy website, one of which I picked up was Minor Seafoods. So working with Simply Energy, they realized they had some flexibility in their refrigeration demands. So they realized they were able to turn down or completely turn off refrigeration for short periods of time without impacting their business operations at all. Another example I'm aware of is a pulp and paper mill, which built so much flexibility into the internal processes that they could pretty much fully disconnect from the electricity grid for a period of a half hour or a couple of half hours in a row and save themselves millions in their electricity purchase costs as a result. So if you look on the right hand side of our picture there, we've got a diagram, and when we think about flex, we use these kind of different time periods that we're thinking about. So a shaping role is sort of within year, across seasons, across days, time periods. And in the power system, traditionally, that was the role played by, say, hydro storage or a coal stockpile or gas storage, these kinds of things where you could shape output across long periods. Then we talk about shifting, which is either across days, or it's from morning to afternoon, or it's from 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. And if you think about the traditional ripple control of hot water cylinders, this was the role that they played, was shifting load from one time of the day to other. We've got shedding, which is kind of dropping load completely for a period of time. And again, the ripple control can do that. There are other bits around can do that. That pulp and paper mill I was talking about was doing that, dropping load completely when the system required it. Or shimmying, which is much more kind of dynamic short-term response. And if you think about big power stations around New Zealand, they have things called governors, and that'll slightly change what the activity of the power station in response to signals that they're getting from the broader power station. So almost kind of not noticeable changes that can happen just to balance out short-term fluctuations. And just to add a bit more context, so we're obviously not the only ones thinking about flexibility in New Zealand. The regulators have got this right at the top of their agenda. So the Electricity Authority's got a group looking at 100% renewable power system, what needs to happen to make that work. And a key part of that is, how do we get a more flexible demand side? How do we get much more from that untapped resource there to balance out those fluctuations in wind and solar? The Electricity Authority is also looking at future security and resilience of the power system, and flexibility will play a key role in that. And MBIE's working on an energy strategy at the moment for release at the end of 2024, and I definitely expect flex to be a key area of focus for them. So as I say, it's really hot topic in New Zealand and globally. There's just masses of work going on in this space about how we can engage more with the demand side and really monetize that untapped resource that sits out there. Next slide, please, James. So as I say, it's a really hot topic, but within New Zealand, it's fair to say, I think it was a topic which was really struggling for a bit of practical leadership. So there were lots of pockets of conversation going on. There were lots of conversations at the kind of regulatory or policy level, but not so much in a kind of cross-sectoral industry perspective. So there's a bit of a vacuum there for that practical leadership. There were certainly projects going on, but we really wanted to bring together a cross-sector group with these three key objectives in mind. So firstly, what are the practical, scalable, least regrets, but really practical steps that we could take to enable households, businesses and communities to make choices which will maximize or monetize the value of that DER and that flexibility. Secondly, can we build a broad consensus across the sector as a whole for the set of actions that are needed to integrate DER into the system? And thirdly, to build that capacity and capability to implement those actions and to integrate DER, really recognizing that we've all got a long way to go. It needs all of us to work together to build on these skills, and we can build on them through learning by doing. I often hear an analogy drawn with the formation of the electricity wholesale market in New Zealand, which happened in the 1990s. It went live in October 1996. But really, that was a much smaller transition than what we're talking about here. That was a very small number of very big assets generating electricity connected to Transpower, and all we were doing there was changing the way that they worked with each other. So the kit was already there, the systems and processes were already there, the system operator was already there. We just went from a sort of more centralized to a more decentralized approach. What we're talking about with the Flex value chain is an order of magnitude more complex. So we're talking about households, consumers, businesses, investing in technology. We're talking about technology companies working with those people. We're talking about the interaction of aggregators and retailers and distribution companies, and also Transpower and the big companies as well. So massively more complex kind of value chain. And the technology itself, some of it's there already, but some of it will need to be rolled out. So it's a really big transition that, you know, it's very exciting, but seriously complex in terms of making it work. Next slide, please, James. That one there, thank you, awesome. So to kind of mirror the extent of that value chain, or the extent of the number of parties that were required, a small number of us decided that it was worth forming an industry group called the FlexForum. We kicked it off in February this year, and these are the logos of the groups that were represented on that FlexForum. So as I was saying, we were really kind of broad church, covering all different aspects of the sector. We had, you know, the really big companies like Mercury was in there. It's got the largest retailer in the country now, with a really strong customer focus. We had Transpower there wearing their multiple hats, so as the grid owner, but also the system operator, and they've also been doing a bunch of trials on demand response, which some of you may well have been involved with. We had 4 distribution companies from one end of New Zealand to the other. So my company Vector from Auckland, Wellington Electricity, Orion from Canterbury, and Aurora from Otago. Had Manawa there, formerly Trustpower, who they own a number of large-scale distributed hydro stations, which have been providing flexibility services for decades now. And then we had a number of consumer-facing orgs like technology companies like Evnex, who develop electric vehicle chargers and sell them to consumers. Solar Zero, who I think at last count had over 10,000 different solar battery units dotted around New Zealand. Cortexo, John's firm, Our Energy, Ecotricity. So as I say, in summary, a really broad church of different parties there to try and make steps, these practical real world steps to really increasing the uptake of flexibility in New Zealand. Also fortunate in the latter half of the process to have observers from the ministry responsible for energy policy. That's the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, the Commerce Commission, Electricity Authority and ECA. So all of those different parties have got kind of key roles in at least overseeing the policy and regulatory environment in which flexibility will thrive. So that's enough from me, I think. I'll hand over to John now, who's going to take through the rest of the slides.
Thanks, James. Called John Campbell, tōku ingoa. For those who don't know me, yeah, founder and CEO of Our Energy, designers and developers of a local energy market platform. And yeah, great to be here today. I mean, demand side flexibility is a key part of what our team believes in and sees it as a real key part of the future for New Zealand's decarbonisation at least cost in the coming decades. So yeah, I'll quickly just go through these last bits so we can get to some of the Q&A. I think that's really important. The flexibility plan 1.0 that the FlexForum has now released and You can see this on the Aotearoa website, and we'll share the link to that a bit later. But basically what that flexibility plan does is try to identify the steps that would be needed for a household, a community, or a business to unlock and maximize the value of their DER, their distributed energy resources, and the flexibility inherent in those. So yeah, the plan is a starting point. It doesn't have all the answers. It's saying these are all the things that need to be resolved amongst parties right across the industry if we're to get more flexibility into our electricity system. Next slide, please, James. So the flexibility plan is essentially divided into what we call 4 steps in the way the FlexForum saw that a household or business or community would try and work out whether they could provide flexibility, and that's the sort of the discover, access, enable, and operate steps that you can see above. And then there are categories of activities that the FlexForum has identified are really necessary to unlock this flexibility for those households, businesses, and communities. And those categories are broadly around information and education that people require, the technical standards that will be needed in order for people to effectively and efficiently transact and provide flexibility. What are the processes, the business processes that would be needed to do that? Are there regulatory settings that are getting in the way or could enhance the use of flexibility in a system? To James's earlier point about how the system really didn't see or hasn't been built up in a way traditionally to see demand side flexibility as an important resource. So there may be things in our regulatory settings that need to be resolved. And then finally, category and sort of an overarching category of activity is this one around coordination and collaboration. And that is really important because Simply Energy, our energy, Vector, and all the other members of FlexForum, no one is going to resolve this issue or get to the answers by themselves. And this also includes working with customers and communities, those households, businesses that I talked about before. So that's a nice segue into the next slide, please, James. So yeah, as I said earlier, the purpose or the immediate purpose of the flexibility plan that has been published is to provide really a starting point for that coordinated and collaborative action amongst parties across the electricity ecosystem in New Zealand. We're not going to get there without working alongside households and businesses and communities. And that's really important. The social license here to do stuff, and work, make this work for Aotearoa New Zealand and reduce emissions at least cost is absolutely critical. So we must work with customers and communities and businesses, the people, like the people represented on this call. That's going to be a really key part of delivering on the flexibility plan. I really like to finish up there, and we can open the field to Q&A. Hopefully lots of questions for James Tipping, and I apologise also just for the noise amongst there. I had a flock of cuckas flying through midway through the presentation, so hopefully that didn't disturb anyone too much.
All good, John. You held it together very well. So yeah, please, if you've got any questions around the FlexForum, please do pop them into the Q&A now so that we can see them. And I've got one to kick things off for you, John and James. Obviously, there's a lot of work that's been going on throughout the year in terms of getting to where you are today with releasing this plan. So thanks first and foremost for the efforts of everyone involved, because it really is a growing area of importance and a growing market in New Zealand, and it's going to be key moving forward. One of the questions I had was, as part of the work that you did scanning this, you're obviously looking outwards from New Zealand as well to try and pick up other examples of best practice and what's happening in other jurisdictions. Could you share any examples of some good, or I'd probably say good rather than best practice, because it is emerging in multiple jurisdictions, but some of the learnings that you took from what's happening outside of Aotearoa as part of your thinking to build up the plan that we see today?
Yeah, sure. James, do you want me to have a crack and you can jump in?
You go first, John. Yep.
Sure. Yeah, so absolutely. Yeah, I mean, the FlexForum was really conscious of the fact that, you know, a number of other countries and jurisdictions have a bit of a jump or a lead on New Zealand in this space. So we were really keen to learn from parties and, you know, again, industry players and regulators and industry associations in those other jurisdictions that had been progressing space. So the FlexForum had, reached out to parties in the UK and Australia to have them present, you know, what had they learnt on their journey over the last, 5-6 years in trying to integrate DER and increase the use of flexibility in their electricity systems. So that was, that has been absolutely crucial in developing the plan that we have here. Aotearoa New Zealand is obviously different, but there are a number of things at a principled level, I think, that we can take from overseas about how you do this. Yeah, we don't need to completely reinvent the wheel.
Yeah, I'd supplement, if I may, James, this a topic that's of real interest to Victor anyway is the impact of electric vehicles on distribution networks, but also the benefits that flexible charging can bring to all parts of the sector. And in the FlexForum, we've got people who are actually involved in a number of trials over in the UK. So they've had some really big trials there testing different models for participation of flexible EV charging. Victor's done its own trials in New Zealand. And if you look across the ditch, I think I dropped in the name of Arena before, so it's ARENA. They are an organisation which oversees a whole lot of innovation development, and I think they've got a number of flex type trials on at the moment. There's one called Project Edge, which is going over there, which is around how do we get more participating in wholesale markets more generally. There's a couple of great EV charging trials with using both on-wall chargers and in-car charging capability, and all with this thing in mind of how do we bundle up that kind of capability and unleash it to provide more services, and how do we give people like the network companies confidence that it can be as good as building a traditional pole and wire into the same area, because everyone needs to get that confidence before we'll be able to fully substitute things out in the future.
Can I just, sorry, James, I'll add just one other answer to that. I think one of the learnings as well that we got from the overseas jurisdictions was, the importance of starting now, that flexibility, if you want it in our electricity system, isn't just going to turn up on day one. We are going to have to make a conscious market development and industry-led approach to bringing it into our system, and it will take, 5 years, at least.
At least,
yeah. It definitely takes time, and we can speak to that from some of our experience. And we've got a couple of questions that have come through from attendees. So I'll start with the one that we've got at the top, either to you, John or James. But what is the biggest risk of us not utilising the flexibility that we have within New Zealand?
I'd say quite simply, the number one would be affordability from my perspective, that we end up building far more power stations, far more transmission grid infrastructure, far more distribution network infrastructure than we actually need, and that those costs need to be recovered and they'll find their way to consumers' bills. So for me, flexibility is an absolute key driver for efficiency, and the more efficient you can be, the lower your costs. So that'd be a key one, and also just finding it way harder to meet our climate change objectives as well.
Yep. Look, just concur with what James said. I mean, I also think just probably, I think there's an innovation piece here, which is important for the productivity of the New Zealand electricity sector and the New Zealand economy generally. The flexibility adds a bunch of what I think economists would call, dynamic efficiency into the sector. And allowing a lot more participants to play and generate value from what's going on. That's a really important part of productivity, which lifts the boat for everyone. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks both. A really interesting question from Gordon asking around some of the practicalities. So for demand flexibility consumers, how much notice are businesses likely to get that demand needs to be lowered? So thanks for that, Gordon, and adding a little bit of flavour to that, around notice that a cold store might have so that it stays within allowable limits. So I'll talk to this in a bit more detail, Gordon, in the next section around some of the work that we are doing within Simply with customers in this space, and in particular cold stores. And it really depends on the types of markets or flexibility markets that you're playing into. So James mentioned earlier the Transpower Demand Response Program, which was running for a good number of years up until 2020. And that was one where you'd get a couple of hours notice about a constraint that was coming up, usually within a winter peak, so that you have time to either manually or automate a response on some equipment. And then there are other markets, flexibility markets, reserves markets, that require an instantaneous response to help balance supply and demand across the grid. So it really comes down to understanding what is happening on the business. Something like a cold store is a fantastic resource that can turn off for periods of time without any detrimental effects to the products. You don't want to be cutting off a processing line or a production line that's going to cause all sorts of havoc if you were even shutting that off for short periods. So it really depends on the markets, and I'll go into a bit more detail in the forthcoming slides around that. We've got one more question before we jump into the next section then, which is, do you think there is sufficient commercial incentives for customers across all spans of New Zealand, so industrial, commercial and residential, to accelerate the adoption of DER and flexibility, or will regulation be required?
It's a great question, that one.
Yeah, great question.
It's really interesting. I've talked before about the range of services that specific technology can provide. James just talked about that it's a bit of horses for courses. Some technology like refrigeration could probably shed load for say a half hour without noticing too much impact, or hot water is another example where you can probably turn off a hot water cylinder for a couple of hours and the consumers won't notice any change in their service level. What's interesting though is we'll talk about this concept of the value stack when we're talking about flexibility. And so there'll be a certain amount of value for a particular piece of distributed energy resource. There'll be a certain amount of value for, say, the distribution network that it sits on. There'll be a certain amount of value in terms of wholesale market energy costs. The ability to shift out of a really high price period to a low price period is one example. James just mentioned that there's another product called instantaneous reserves, where if you have the ability to suddenly shed load without notice, but for either 6 seconds or 60 seconds, within 6 seconds or within 60 seconds for a period of either a minute or 15 minutes, then you can get paid for that. Transpower may also have other value where they can write contracts for long-term deferrals of investment. So there are all these different value streams, And the more of them you can stack up together, the greater the total value that there is for the DER. So individually, on a single stream of revenue, it may not be enough to justify an investment. But if you can start stacking those things up, then absolutely, absolutely.
Brilliant. Thanks, James. It probably leads us quite nicely into the next section to talk around some of the kind of practical examples that are going on in New Zealand at the moment, and to tell a bit about our story as well. So just for the benefit of those who don't know me, I realized I didn't mention at the beginning, but I have the privilege of leading our sustainable opportunities team here in Simply. And one of the key strands of our team is focusing on supporting our commercial and industrial customers with flexibility services. So I'm slightly biased, but I think it's an exciting space to be working in, and there's going to be some really exciting things happening over the next 5, 10, 20 years across not only the New Zealand network, but globally. So if we zoom in, and a few of these have popped up, we just talked about that Transpower Demand Response Program, but I just wanted to touch on a couple of areas and things that are happening, and innovations and pockets of innovations and trials and solutions that are coming through. And really part of the motivation with the FlexForum is how do you share this best practice, but bring together all of these learnings of what's happened in the past, what's happening today, and then how we move forward to support the growth of flexibility within New Zealand. On the left-hand side there is a really interesting project that's happening down in the Aurora network, so in the Upper Clutha region. And this is to support a growth constraint effectively within that region. So there's a decision that's being made or needs to be made around, okay, do we install more poles and wires to provide the capacity to a region, or can we defer some of that installation and that growth with some flexibility within the network? And Aurora have set up a partnership with Solar Zero, so the solar and battery installer at a domestic level, to help meet some of those constraints during peak times. So storing some of the generation that comes off the solar panels that they install, put them into the household batteries, and then utilize that to provide and to power some of those homes during the period where there's a bit of a constraint, and support some of those investment decisions and defer them further down the line. So a really interesting project. And to James's point earlier around the interest in the smart EV charging that's coming through, it presents both a challenge, as you can see on that far right with Mitsubishi Motors, but also an opportunity. So you effectively you have a battery that sits within the vehicle on your drive. And I think it was just back in June that Mitsubishi have started trialing feeding from the battery within the vehicle into households within New Zealand. So rather than just turning off and not charging during a peak, you're actually then putting that energy back into the household to power it during the peak, and then charging it back up again when, one, the cost of electricity is cheaper, but also the grid is a lot greener. And we'll look at a bit of that pattern over a 24-hour period in a moment. Finally, the Transpower Demand Response Program, I think this kicked off back in 2007, ran through to 2020, and was a real learning exercise around the interest and the availability of flexible load across New Zealand to be able to support during times of peak demand. So as we've discussed previously, notably those peak periods during the winter. And now Transpower are taking all the learnings from that program and working with a number of players across the industry to see how they can continue to support and use their platform at both a distribution and at a network level as well. So I took a couple of snapshots, and this comes from the EM6 platform that Transpower have available. And interestingly, at the end of last year, they added their grid emissions tracking tool to the platform. And you can access this. It's available just via the EM6 website, which gives you instantaneous view of energy pricing across New Zealand. But if you look at the graphic at the bottom, what was introduced at the end of last year is that live view on a half-hour basis of what the renewable energy share is in New Zealand, and equally what the actual carbon emissions factor is at that point. And I took a snapshot of this data from 2 weeks ago. So this was Tuesday, early in the month, 6th of September. And there's a pattern here that's probably reasonably obvious, that the green line shows you the percentage renewables across the grid during the day. And as you get towards those peak periods, so obviously demand is increasing across the network, we are seeing a shift in the renewable percentage across the grid. But what I thought was quite interesting in this space, just within one day, we see a shift between 97% renewables, so overnight, down to about 81% at 7 p.m., so that evening peak. And between those 2 points, so only a matter of 5 hours difference, you're seeing a carbon emissions factor of 4 times what it is during those off-peak periods. So a real shift in terms of what the emissions are. And that is predominantly down to the fact that we are relying on thermal peaking, so both from gas generation and coal generation to help us meet that demand during the peaks. But quite a big shift, and it shows the importance of not only just from an emissions perspective, but also from a cost perspective of if you have the ability to shift load and take it out of those peaks, it's not only good for emissions, but it's also good for reducing costs as well. We've pulled some numbers through here of well, what is the impact here, and as I alluded to there, the reason that you're getting that reduction, obviously in renewable percentages, is that requirement on thermal peaking. But just running some quick numbers, if we were to displace 100 megawatts of coal generation for 2 hours during an evening peak, and just to give you some perspective, the highest peak we've had this year was back in July, which was about 6,800 megawatts. So 100 megawatts is about 1.5% of that peak demand. So if we can shave that through load shifting or just shifting EV charging outside of a peak, that results in an emissions reduction of 200 tons. So this is talking about an emissions reduction over just a 2-hour period. To give you some perspective on 200 tons, I've just got the calculator out earlier, and it's equivalent to around 20 years of sequestration from 3,000 native trees. So ultimately, that is a big chunk of carbon that would take a long time via tree planting to sequester. So big impact, especially when we focus around that morning and evening peak. So I wanted to talk a little bit around some of the work that we're doing in this space. There's a lot of innovation going on, as I mentioned earlier, with the Transfer Demand Response Program, the great work that people within the FlexForum are currently doing, those partnerships that are building between networks, solutions providers, technology providers, ensuring that we install smart EV chargers rather than dumb EV chargers that have that ability to control. And this is an area that we know pretty well, having played in it since 2016. So our flexibility, what we call Demand Flex as a program, kicked off back in 2016 through some residential trials with Wellington Electricity, really to test out what is the value of having flexibility. And the focus at the time there was in a similar vein to the Solar Zero project. So having batteries installed at residential households and using them to support constraints during peak demand. Once we went through that initial pilot period, we realized that we could scale quite quickly by pivoting slightly and focusing on larger commercial and industrial loads. So a lot of growth, a lot of development to build up the platform to allow us to be able to bring flexible load to the market and create value for customers. And in 2019, we brought our first customer on board, and we've grown now to around 45 customers that give us a flexible portfolio of over 20 megawatts. And the way that this particular program works is that we will go out to customer sites, commercial, industrial, and we're really looking for those flexible assets. We talked earlier about cold storage, so anything that has a level or an ability to turn off for a period of time without significantly impacting operations on that site. So cold storage is a really good example. Probably about 70% of the load within our portfolio comes from cold storage. Pumps is another really good one. So wastewater treatment plants that can turn pumps off for a short period and then re-engage them later on. We have wood processing as well, where we can turn off electric fans during a processing period. So it might be drying wood within kilns and turning off for a short period, either a few minutes, half an hour, and some can turn off for a longer period. But as I say, cold storage is kind of an area that we're getting a lot of focus on, just because of the inherent flexibility and ability to turn off for longer periods. And this is where it starts to get really interesting, and the question that we had earlier around, well, what kind of information do I need, or what kind of notice do I get if I'm going to participate in a market? The growth of our program has strongly focused on this left-hand side here of the value stream, which is frequency response, and what we also termed as interruptible load earlier. And this is really the ability to quickly shut down loads at a customer site to help balance supply and demand. So if we had an issue across the grid, like a failure at a large generation plant, we quite quickly find ourselves in a scenario where we've got an imbalance of supply and demand. So what we do for customers here is we will install our equipment on site, which will monitor the frequency of the grid. And when the frequency is dropping, that signifies that we've got an imbalance. So supply is greater than, demand is greater than supply. And we will turn off customer equipment. James mentioned there's two markets and you can get value from both of them. One usually involves just turning off for a very short period, a minute, and the other one is usually up to 15 minutes to half an hour. And this is really key for enabling us to ultimately keep the lights on and keep the reliability of the grid, and will become even more important as we get more intermittent renewables coming on board. The middle one is demand response, and we call it demand response in the sense that a signal is sent asking for a reduction in load. So this is exactly how the Transpower Demand Response Program worked, which would say, hey, we can see that we're going to hit a constraint at this time in this area. And we're going to send a signal, and it was typically in the morning, if it was for the evening peak, allowing people to make a decision on whether they could or couldn't participate in that market. So this is really great for those winter peaks when you need a response, you need some quick, or you need the ability to drop load, usually over a 2 to 3 hour period. And then the final strand is something that we're testing with a couple of our customers at the moment, which is around local demand management. So how do you shift the profile of your own consumption to reduce your own electricity costs and equally your network costs? So depending on what supply tariff you're on and what network tariff on, there are motivations across some of these to obviously shift your load and change your consumption pattern where possible to realize savings. And some of these can stack up, which is the beauty of combining potentially a request that might come through from Transpower to reduce during a peak, but that might also coincide with a period where you know your electricity pricing is higher anyway. So the shifting of that load can provide not only a payment from participating in a demand response program, but it also can reduce your energy bills and potentially your network costs as well from shaping that load. And James mentioned earlier, from a vector perspective, this is going to become a very interesting space when we get real penetration of EV charging across the residential space that can add, around 50% of your current consumption to your load. So that's going to become an area that takes, there's a lot more scrutiny around how we get smarter with the times at which we use electricity. And then I wanted to touch on the motivations for why people participate, and it links to one of the questions we had earlier around the incentives and are they enough for certain customers. The customers certainly that we speak to, we can certainly put cash in their pocket through participating in something like the interruptible load reserves market. But we found some of the customers are just really keen to participate from the impact that it can have on both supporting the grid, but also reducing their own emissions. It really varies across customers. I think the sweet spot and the great thing about flexibility is you can tick multiple boxes here. So you can provide a new revenue stream, or you can reduce a bill whilst reducing emissions at the same time. It can take a bit of time. The journey for customers to go on to get comfortable with the idea of participating is always an interesting one. We might get a quick thumbs up from a finance director early on, and then you start engaging with an operations manager at a site, and it starts with, there's no way you're touching any equipment. And as you go through the journey, you go, well, actually, hey, we could turn this equipment off, or hey, we had a power cut 7 months ago and everything powered back up fine. And so it's a really interesting journey once you just talk through it and obviously give some of the examples of customers that are participating elsewhere. It's amazing to kind of take customers on that journey and be able to move forward. The third bit is really interesting is kind of a resilience piece, but also a growth piece. So a lot of commercial customers that already have fossil fuel usage on site, so process heat being a good example, are looking to electrify, but they will have an existing constraint in terms of how much supply can get to their site today. And the benefit of flexibility is there's a cost, of course, to increase your capacity to bring more electricity if you're looking at, say, transitioning from a coal boiler over to an electric boiler to reduce emissions. But the beauty of bringing flexibility to the table is going, well, hey, if we're able to shift that consumption pattern, and if it is producing something like hot water from a boiler, could we include something like storage so that we can use the boiler during the off-peak time to heat up water and then utilize that during a peak period. We're now starting a couple of projects which we'll touch on in our next series within the webinar, which is around process heat and that transition away from fossil fuels, around how we can actually look at carbon responsive dispatch. So when the electricity price is low, we can send signals to start operating electrical equipment. And then if they have existing coal or even biomass generation moving forward, they can switch over and fuel switch during those periods when electricity is at a price that it's uneconomical to run. So we're going to go into a bit more detail in the next webinar in that space. So I'll stop there and we'll pick that up next time. Brilliant. So wanted to round out there and thanks for your time. I know it's been a bit of a whistle-stop tour covering quite a lot. I can see that we've had a few questions coming through, so I just wanted to jump through some of these. So first one coming in is, with the Demand Flex platform, what's the greatest learning for Simply so far? I think one of the key things, and this links into what John said earlier, is it's a tricky area and it takes time. It takes time both to develop the technology, to get the confidence of customers, and also just for the markets to change and develop, to be, to have the right settings around where does flexibility play and what is the value of flexibility in the market. So that would probably for us be, there's quite a few learnings in that, but it really is about starting early and knowing where these constraints are coming. So there are certainly discussions going on at the moment. I know Vector have put out notifications for requests for information around who can support, knowing that constraints are coming into the future. So, hey, the constraint might not be there today, but we know the constraint will be there in 2025. And ultimately, it's a call to action. Can that be met with existing customer load? Could that be supported through distributed batteries? Could that be supported through smart EV charging rather than just simple EV charging that doesn't have any control flexibility? So really, it's that this is a long journey, and really why FlexForum has been set up, so that we can bring together these learnings and these building blocks to move forward. Another question we've got here. Now that we're educated consumers, in your opinion, what are the best ways we can support this industry push to develop flexible demand processes and markets? I'll probably pass that over to either John or James for that one, because it ties in nicely with the work that you're doing.
Sure. James, I'll have a go, shall I? Yeah. Yeah, look, I think, and as I mentioned before, it's absolutely crucial that we work with the customers, the households, businesses, and communities that are going to be providing this flexibility. Yeah. The industry can't just develop a siloed top-down solution and expect it to work. If we want that demand side flexibility, we are going to have to, find ways to, collaborate with those households, businesses, and communities. I think that's a really crucial bit. And I pick, just as an extension of that, pick up on a point you made earlier, James, about the motivations for customers to get involved in this space, is that they're actually really varied. And one of the things that Our Energy discovers in this space is actually that myth that customers don't want to participate or don't care about their energy use. All they care about is the bottom line on their bill. It's sort of a bit of a myth that the industry has built up over time. Yeah. And we've intentionally, I think, designed out the customer side in the markets we have today. And so it is going to take time to design that back in. Yeah. So that's a point I think is really crucial.
I'd say just a couple of things to add to that. So as households, we can make a difference. So personally, I've just switched to a retailer that offers a time of use tariff. So I pay significantly less for using electricity overnight and in the weekends compared to the peak periods in the daytime. And I've reprogrammed certain things around the house to make use of that. And, it's the role of retailers there to develop offerings that consumers want. So if enough consumers vote with their feet for these kinds of things, we'll see more different offerings coming out from the retail side. Second thing I'd add is anytime you're contemplating any kind of new investment, I know there's a lot of electrification projects being considered at the moment. really at the front of your mind is how can I build in flexibility into my systems and processes as I'm making these investments, and talk to people like Simply or other consultants out there who have that role of helping people to monetize that flexibility that you're building in.
Brilliant. Thanks, James. A question we've got here from Andrew is just asking a question around the load shifting and what that does for emissions reduction. So, and asking whether if we're shifting outside of a peak time when we've got high fossil fuel or could have high fossil fuel consumption, is that actually going to result in a reduction in emissions? I think what I'd add to that, Andrew, if we shifted a peak of a similar magnitude and just shifted it a few hours, then correct, we would still continue to have a high emissions profile because we ultimately have baseload renewable generation through hydro, through geothermal that stacks up, and it's only once we maximize the generation from those assets that we then start tipping into thermal generation through gas peaking, through coal generation, and obviously the emissions increases. So if that peak is shifted and stays at the same magnitude, then yes, we would still be using fossil fuels. But the idea with the load shedding is because you have a morning peak and an evening peak, it's about filling those periods in between, the off peak during the middle of the day and overnight, to a level that doesn't go above or doesn't breach what we can currently meet with renewable generation. And that's really the key around that front.
Yeah, it's a good point, James. Yeah, it's a flattening of the existing peak rather than a complete avoidance or taking away or shifting that peak completely. Yeah.
I'd add that the concept of peak and off peak will probably remain to a reasonable extent on distribution networks like yours, Andrew, and like ours in Victor. But on the grid, it's going to become much more about windy and not windy, and sunny and not sunny, and rainy and not rainy. And that's going to be the dominating factor here. So, outfits like, I think Genesis have teamed up with an EV company called EVNEX, and they're now offering their customers the ability to charge their cars when carbon emissions are lowest and not charge them when they're highest. So it's all about, it's less about peak off peak. It's more about responding to what's happening on the system more generally. Yeah.
And the questions come around any data on renewable curtailment, sorry. So I'd imagine shifting load to high renewable share times would only bring down emissions if those renewables were otherwise would have been curtailed. So I think it's a good point. If you can't shift across if there is no wind in the preceding period. And this is where there's a real balance between, and geothermal is such a great resource within New Zealand because it is a baseload renewable. The important thing to note with geothermal, as well as it is being a renewable source, there are some emissions associated with it. So there is a lot of work being done around the industry, around things like the gases that come through from geothermal. How do you re-inject that back into the ground so that you can reduce the carbon footprint of some of those geothermal sources? It is significantly lower than coal and gas, but there is a footprint, and that's something that will get a bit of scrutiny and focus on that I know the renewable generators are focusing on at the moment. Great question from Gordon around how are customers able to realize carbon savings by load shifting during periods of high carbon intensity, given that most carbon inventories use a grid average carbon factor? And this is a really good question. You calculate, if you are calculating your emissions as a business, you will stack up your kilowatt hours across the year of consumption, and the standard way at the moment to calculate that from an accounting perspective is to multiply that by the average grid emissions factor. There's a bit of work going on around how do you start looking into time-based emissions. So you would say, not only was my consumption X number of kilowatt hours across the year, but I consumed it in these half-hour periods. And this is the value of having this data now that's coming through from the likes of Transpower to show you what the grid emissions factor is per half-hour period. We're not there yet from a carbon reporting perspective, but I do think we will start to see some interest in matching that. And you're seeing that from a renewable procurement perspective as well, where large businesses, certainly international, not only want to match their consumption with renewable generation, but they're starting to do what's called time-based matching. So can they match all of their consumption at the time that renewables are generating? That's very tricky, especially when you're matching against something like wind or solar because of the intermittent nature of it. We've probably got time for one more question because we are just at 12. So go down to, what duration DR do you see as providing the highest value, and to which industry participants? Gen Taylor, EDB, Transpower. Is short shimmy longer? And is this more about dynamic response or planned response?
Great question. I mean, this goes to the heart of the value stack question. You know, how does that value stack look like at the moment? How might it look tomorrow? How might it look next year or next decade? You know, at the moment, we've got a relatively large proportion of hydro, and so unlike other parties or other countries, the value of short-term response to the wholesale market's less at the moment because hydro plays that balancing role, whereas in a country like Australia, where they don't have the hydro, they have a lot more short-term volatility in the wholesale market. That may change in time. I think I've seen work done by, I think, Sapere for the EA on a cost-benefit analysis that shows the kind of the rough value of a megawatt, let's say, of demand response is probably greatest to an EDB in terms of the value stack at the moment. And that's likely to continue over the future. But again, the duration of these things really matters as well. So an EDB is really focused, as I said before, around peak, off peak. The wholesale market, it could be windy, not windy, or dry, not dry. So if you can do that long-term response and manage dry year risks, that's a huge factor. So I think there's no obvious answer to that question other than it's quite dynamic, and it will change. But the important bit is that the system needs lots of different services providing lots of different time durations.
I'd say also, just to add to that, James, there's the question of the issue of location as well. Yeah, that, you know, even across an EDB like Vector, there are very different bits of that network that may or may not be constrained at different times. Yeah.
It really starts to become a supply and demand. You know, if there is a strong demand for it, and what is the counterfactual? If there is a strong decision around needing additional poles and wires, say at a distribution level, you know, there is a big counterfactual in terms of cost of, we're going to build something, or can we meet it with a level of flexibility? So, and I know that's one of the streams from FlexForum, is how do we increase the visibility of where this demand is, where is flexibility needed across, you know, all of New Zealand? Is there a greater need in one particular area than another? And then that allows people who can provide flexibility, or a solution provider, to say, hey, we think we can come up with a smart solution in that space to meet that requirement. Whereas you've got things like the interruptible load, the reserves market, that are island-based markets. So there's a South Island market and a North Island market that have a value associated with them. But yeah, ultimately, if a customer has more flexibility, there's more value. If they can go for longer periods, we can participate in more schemes, more initiatives. I'm mindful that we're a couple of minutes over the 12 o'clock mark, so we'll look to round out there. But just want to say a big thank you to John and James. Thanks for joining us for this particular session around flexibility. It's been really insightful. If you do have any more questions, please just reach out to us directly after this. Would love to continue the conversation. There's a lot of interesting work going on across the industry. Yeah, it's something that all three of us certainly like talking about. So more than happy to continue the discussion. As I mentioned earlier, our next webinar will be in a couple of months' time, before the end of the year, where we're going to do a bit more of a deeper dive into the transition away from fossil fuels, with a strong focus in the process heat space. So hopefully you'll be able to join us then. But thanks for your time today, and we'll sign out there.
Thank you.
Thanks.